ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the show. You're watching your top human rights organization review, and I am your host, Bryce Dolan. Now, usually on the show, we cover 5 different top human rights organizations or 5 top think tanks. Today, we're going to cover 4 different top human rights organizations, but we're still going to cover 5 stories. There's 2 stories on Amnesty International's website in particular that really needed our attention. Now, we'll start the show with Amnesty International in Bahrain as activists are jailed over their tweets. Next, Human Rights Watch in Kenya look into alleged abuses by security forces. Again with Amnesty International, an Iranian writer is forcibly arrested after writing an article against the practice of stoning. Then, the Human Rights Foundation urges democratic countries to not elect dictatorships to the UN Human Rights Council. And then we'll end the show with the Norwegian Refugee Council as they tell us a horrific story of one family's deadly journey out of Mosul. Now, Bahraini authorities must immediately and unconditionally release human rights activist Nabil Rajab and opposition leader Fadhel Abbas, 2 prisoners of conscience who are facing long prison sentences for using Twitter to voice concerns about human rights abuses in the conflict in Yemen. Now, both men have criticized the killing of civilians in Yemen by the Saudi Arabia-led coalition, which includes Bahrain. They have already been wrongfully detained for months and are expecting their respective courts' verdicts in the next week. It is an outrage that Nabil Rajab and Fadhel Abbas have spent even 1 minute in jail. The Bahraini authorities cannot silence every last critic by throwing them behind bars. They must drop all charges against Nabil Rajab and quash Fadhel Abbas's 5-year jail term, and immediately cease the relentless crackdown on freedom of expression, said Sama Hadid, Deputy Director of Campaigns at Amnesty International's Beirut Regional Office. Now, in a climate of increasing hostility towards dissent of any kind, Bahrain needs independent voices like Nabil Rajab and Fadhel Abbas more than ever. They should be applauded and protected, not punished, for their brave efforts to raise human rights concerns. As well as calling for the immediate and unconditional release of Fadhel Abbas and Nabil Rajab, we are urging that Bahraini authorities to repeal or amend laws that criminalize the peaceful exercise of the right to freedom of expression, in line with Bahrain's obligations under international law, said Sama Hadid. So, let's make it a little bit more personal. Bring it back to the States here. Look at everything that's said on Twitter during and after the presidential debates and any other big event. Everybody, not everybody, but a large majority of people get on there, put in their 140 characters, and then they take off. No consequences, no punishment, nothing because of their actions on Twitter. These 2 spoke out on Twitter about innocent civilians being slaughtered, and they get arrested. They need to fix that immediately and hopefully release these 2 human rights activists who were just trying to draw attention to a horrific problem. Now, next, Human Rights Watch and Kenya look into the abuses performed by the security forces. The Kenya National Commission on Human Rights, the KNCHR, a constitutionally mandated body, started investigating how insecurity has affected human rights in the increasingly restive coast region, where there have been scores of allegations of abuses by the security forces. Now, most of these abuses stem from security forces' heavy-handed response to Al-Shabaab's attacks. Now, coastal communities have paid a heavy price. In June 2014, Al-Shabaab launched a deadly night raid, killing at least 49 people in the coastal town of Pekatoni. Now, this was the first of a series of attacks in Lamu and Tana River counties over the next weeks. An investigation by several human rights organizations, such as Haiki Africa and Muslims for Human Rights, found that Kenyan security agencies were abusive in responding to these attacks. Haiki Africa was the first to debunk the notion promoted mainly by politicians that the attack was linked to the political opposition, fingering Al-Shabaab and highlighting key human rights concerns. Now, Human Rights Watch found that security forces were slow to respond to these attacks, and when they did, they rounded up villagers, mostly Muslim and members of Somali ethnicities, and beat and arbitrarily detained them. All those arrested were either released without charge, had charges dropped, or were acquitted for lack of evidence. Now, the KNCHR inquiry offers a rare opportunity to highlight more recent abuses and renew public attention on this worrying issue. KNCHR Chair Kagwiria Mboguri said at least 303 cases of extrajudicial killings, disappearances, torture, and related human rights violations have been reported along the coast since 2013. That's over 100 cases a year, ladies and gentlemen, over 300 cases in the last 3 years. And this is before the inquiry, which will likely receive other fresh complaints as it kicks off. Now, it's essential that this time the findings and recommendations of the inquiry are not brushed aside by the government officials, as has been the case in the past. Kenyans are yearning for justice. Now, we touched on this in an earlier segment that there was a number of alleged cases of abuse by security forces in Kenya, yet nothing was being done. Although this is a small start, it is a step forward into investigating and stopping these alleged abuses. Now, back to Amnesty International. They call on Iranian authorities for the immediate release of human rights activist Golrak Ebrahimi Urei following her arrest. Now, despite the fact that no official summons has been raised, Urei's home was raided by officials who violently broke through her door and took her to Evin prison in Tehran. Now, it appears that she has been taken to the women's ward to begin serving her 6-year prison sentence. She has been convicted of charges including insulting Islamic sanctities for writing an unpublished story about the horrific practice of stoning in Iran. An unpublished story. She wrote a story about it, didn't publish it anywhere, and they broke into her house and took her to prison for 6 years. Now, Urei's husband, Arash Sadeghi, a human rights activist and prisoner of conscience, has since started a hunger strike in protest at her imprisonment. Urei is the last young writer and activist to be caught up in Iran's relentless crackdown on artistic expression. Her imprisonment for peacefully voicing her opposition to stoning is a terrible injustice and an outrageous assault on freedom of expression. It is also a shocking and deeply disturbing display of support for the cruel and inhumane punishment of stoning, said Magdalena Mughrabi, Deputy Director for the Middle East and North Africa at Amnesty International. The Iranian authorities must break this cycle of injustice and immediately and unconditionally release Golrak Ebrahimi Urei. We also urge them to ensure that her conviction is quashed. Urei is being punished for the peaceful exercise of her human rights. But the crime is not of this case, is Iran's ongoing retention of the horrific practice of stoning, which amounts to torture. Now, instead of doggedly intimidating and imprisoning critical voices, the authorities should abolish this cruel punishment once and for all, said Magdalena Mughrabi. Now, next, moving on to Human Rights Foundation. The HRF urges democratic governments at the UN General Assembly not to vote for authoritarian regimes in the upcoming election of the 2017-2019 members of the UN Human Rights Council. Now, governments seeking election into the UN's top human rights body this year include China, Cuba, Egypt, Iraq, Malaysia, Russia, Rwanda, and Saudi Arabia. Now, earlier this month, Human Rights Foundation and UN Watch hosted a series of events at the Parliament of Canada in Ottawa and at the UN headquarters in New York, denouncing the bids placed this year by authoritarian states to sit on the council. It is deplorable that the UN will soon entrust the protection of the world's human rights to some of the worst dictatorships and authoritarian regimes on the planet, said Human Rights Foundation President Thor Halvorsen. Just a decade after its founding, the Council today reveals the same symptoms of hypocrisy, double standards, and gutlessness displayed by the discredited Human Rights Commission that preceded it. Democracies at the UN must raise their voices against authoritarian states that employ its bully pulpits to silence their human rights victims and deflect attention. Now, to do otherwise is to side with the oppressors, Halverson said. Now, on October 6th, Human Rights Foundation and UN Watch presented a joint report at the UN Correspondents Association that analyzes this year's candidates. The report assesses the suitability of each candidate based on a two-pronged analysis of selection criteria developed by the UN General Assembly in 2006. The report concludes that 8 of the 17 candidate states are not qualified to serve at the UNHRC given their poor records of domestic human rights protection and their negative UN voting records. The 8 countries identified in the report as unfit are China, Cuba, Egypt, Iraq, Malaysia, Russia, Rwanda, and Saudi Arabia. Now, according to the United Nations General Assembly Resolution 60-251 that established the Council, candidates for the 47-member body must uphold the highest standards in the promotion and protection of human rights. So electing China, Cuba, Egypt, Iraq, Malaysia, Russia, Rwanda, and Saudi Arabia would be in violation of international law, said Human Rights Foundation Chief Legal Officer Javier Al-Haig. Now, the likely election of these 8 human rights violators would permit them to hide their abuses behind the cloak of UN legitimacy. Once part of the Council, these regimes typically stifle any attempts to investigate their abuses. So we hope that the UN General Assembly heeds the warning of Human Rights Foundation and the president of Human Rights Foundation and the legal officer of the Human Rights Foundation and the whole organization to not elect dictatorships and authoritarian regimes to a Human Rights Council. I mean, it's only common sense, ladies and gentlemen. Why elect country representatives to be on a council that advocates and protects human rights when these countries are violating them every day? It only makes sense to keep them off the Human Rights Council. Now, to end the show, the NRC, the Norwegian Refugee Council, draws our attention back to Iraq and its refugees. Now, we have mentioned in an earlier segment that the NRC is working around the clock to prepare for the mass exodus from Mosul. Also, in an earlier segment, we talked about how families in and around Mosul are in a dangerous position. Stay at their home and risk being caught in the crossfire, or try to escape facing the dangers of running into troops, snipers, mines, and a number of other dangerous situations. Unfortunately, we have a story with a not so happy ending to end the show. Now, Ibrahim Hussein Muhammad lost 2 daughters on the dangerous escape route leaving their home in the outskirts of Mosul. 10 minutes into our journey, 2 of my daughters tripped a wire connected to an explosive device planted on the ground, and it went off. My 9-year-old daughter was killed immediately. Nothing remained of her. When we met him and what was left of his family in a tent in the Dabaga camp, the camp currently hosted over 8,000 families who have fled their homes and cities surrounding Mosul and elsewhere. He continues to tell the NRC, "We buried her in the rubble." Another daughter aged 17 had her leg blown off. Her mother carried her as he had a serious heart problem. She carried her for an hour until they reached the army. They welcomed them and wanted to help them, but by the time they reached his daughter, she was already dead. They then transported them to the Dabaga camp in cars. So, ladies and gentlemen, again, we see this lose-lose situation for refugees in Iraq, more specifically in Mosul and in the surrounding areas. They were just trying to leave their home to find safety so they didn't get caught in the crossfire, in the shooting, and the fighting, all of that in Mosul and in the surrounding cities. And 10 minutes into their journey, he loses 2 of his little girls. Well, ladies and gentlemen, you can find the links directly to all of these articles below in the description. Subscribe to our YouTube channel, give us a like on Facebook, or follow us on Twitter. But thank you for watching, and that does it for your top human rights organization review, and I was your host, Bryce Dolan.